Hey guys, hoping all is well with everyone. So in this video we are going to be introducing a new read-along story, but it is in the continuation of a book series that I had started a little bit while back, and it is the Wayside School book series. And so this is book 2 of the series, and it is called Wayside School is Falling Down, and it is by Louis Sachar and illustrated by Adam McCulley. And if you guys have not ever heard of this series, or it's just been a while, it's a very silly, very funny book series with a lot of interesting twists and turns, with a lot of interesting but funny characters. So I hope you guys enjoy this read along, and I'll be showing you guys all the pictures as we go. They usually do an illustration at the beginning of each chapter, but I hope you guys enjoy this, and without further ado, let's jump into Wayside School is Falling Down by Louis Sachar and illustrated by Adam McCulley. Chapter 1. A Package from Mrs. Jewls. Louis, the yard teacher, frowned. The schoolyard was a mess. There were pencils and pieces of paper everywhere. How'd all this junk get here? He wondered. Well, I'm not going to pick it up. It wasn't his job to pick up garbage. He was just supposed to pass out the balls during lunch and recess, and also make sure the kids didn't kill each other. He sighed, then began cleaning it up. He loved all the children at Wayside School. He didn't want them playing on a dirty playground. As he was picking up the pencils and pieces of paper, a large truck drove into the parking lot. It honked its horn twice, then twice more. Louis ran to the truck. "Quiet," he whispered. "Children are trying to learn in there." He pointed at the school. A short man with big, bushy hair stepped out of the truck. "I have a package for somebody named Mrs. Jewls," he said. "I'll take it," said Louis. "Are you Mrs. Jewls?" asked the man. "No," said Louis. "I have to give it to Mrs. Jewls," said the man. Louis thought a moment. He didn't want the man disturbing the children. He knew how much they hated to be interrupted when they were working. "I'm Mrs. Jewls," he said. "But you just said you weren't Mrs. Jewls," said the man. "I changed my mind," said Louis. The man got the package out of the back of the truck and gave it to Louis. "Here you go, Mrs. Jewls," he said. "Ah," Louis grunted. It was a very heavy package. The word fragile was printed on every side. He had to be careful not to drop it. The package was so big, Louis couldn't see where he was going. Fortunately, he knew the way to Mrs. Jewls' class by heart. It was straight up. Wayside School was 30 stories high, with only one room on each story. Mrs. Jewls' class was at the very top. It was Louis's favorite class. He pushed through the door to the school, then started up the stairs. There was no elevator. There were stairs that led to the basement, too, but nobody ever went down there. There were dead rats living in the basement. The box was pressed against Louis's face, squashing his nose. Even so, when he reached the 15th floor, he could smell Miss Mush cooking in the cafeteria. It smelled like she was making mushrooms. "Maybe on my way back, I'll stop by Mrs. Mush's room and get some mushrooms," he thought. He didn't want to miss Miss Mush's mushrooms. They were her specialty. He huffed and groaned and continued up the stairs. His arms and legs were very sore, but he didn't want to rest. This package might be important, he thought. I have to get it to Mrs. Jewls right away. He stepped easily from the 18th story to the 20th. There was no 19th story. Miss Zarves taught the class on the 19th story. There was no Miss Zarves. At last he struggled up the final step to the 30th story. He knocked on Mrs. Jewls' door with his head. Mrs. Jewls was in the middle of teaching her class about gravity when she heard the knock. "Come in," she called. "I can't open the door," Louis gasped. "My hands are full. I have a package for you." Mrs. Jewls faced the class. "Who wants to open the door for Louis?" she asked. All the children raised their hands. They loved to be interrupted when they were working. "Oh dear, how shall I choose?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "I have to be fair about this." "I know, we'll have a spelling bee, and the winner will get to open the door." Louis knocked his head against the door again. "It's heavy," he complained, "and I'm very tired." "Just a second," Mrs. Jewls called back. "Allison, the first word's for you. Heavy." "Heavy," said Allison. Heavy. Heavy. "Very good. Jason, you're next." "Tired." "Tired," said Jason. Sleepy. Tired. Louis felt the package slipping from his sweaty fingers. He shifted his weight to get a better grip. The corners of the box dug into the sides of his arms. He felt his hands go numb. Actually, he didn't feel them go numb. "Jenny, package." "Package," said Jenny. B-O-X. Package. "Excellent," said Mrs. Jewls. Louis felt like he was going to faint. At last, John opened the door. "I won the spelling bee, Louis," he said. "Very good, John," muttered Louis. "Aren't you going to shake my hand?" asked John. Louis shifted the box to one arm, quickly shook John's hand, then grabbed the box again and staggered into the room. "Where do you want it, Mrs. Jewls?" he asked. "I don't know," said Mrs. Jewls. "What is it?" "I don't know," said Louis. "I'll have to put it down someplace so you can open it." "But how can I tell you where to put it until I know what it is?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "You might put it in the wrong place." So Louis held the box, and Mrs. Jewls stood on a chair next to him and tore open the top. His legs wobbled beneath him. "It's a computer!" exclaimed Mrs. Jewls. Everybody booed. "What's the matter?" asked Louis. "I thought everyone loved computers." "We don't want it, Louis," said Eric Bacon. "Take it back, Jack," said Terence. "Get that piece of junk out of here," said Mauricia. "Now, don't be that way," said Mrs. Jewls. "The computer will help us learn. It's a lot quicker than a pencil and paper." "But the quicker we learn, the more work we have to do," complained Todd. "You may set it over there on the counter, Louis," said Mrs. Jewls. Louis set the computer on the counter next to Sherry's desk. Then he collapsed on the floor. "Now, watch closely," said Mrs. Jewls. Everyone gathered around the new computer. It had a full-color monitor and had 2 disk drives. Mrs. Jewls pushed it out the window. They all watched it fall and smash against the sidewalk. "See?" said Mrs. Jewls. "That's gravity." "Oh, now I get it," said Joe. "Thank you, Louis," said Mrs. Jewls. "I have been trying to teach them about gravity all morning. We have been using pencils and pieces of paper, but the computer was a lot quicker." Chapter 2. Mark Miller. Mrs. Jewls rang her cowbell. "I would like you to meet Mark Miller," she said. "He and his family just moved here all the way from Macedonia." Everyone stared at the new kid. He stood at the front of the room. His knees were shaking. He hated having to stand in front of the class. It was as if Mrs. Jewls had brought him in for show and tell. He felt like some kind of weirdo. He just wanted to sit at a desk and be like everyone else. But worst of all, his name wasn't Mark Miller. His name was Benjamin Nushmutt, and he had moved from Hempleton, not Macedonia. But he was too scared to mention that to Mrs. Jewls. He was afraid to correct a teacher. "Why don't you tell the class a little bit about yourself, Mark?" suggested Mrs. Jewls. Benjamin didn't know what to say. He wished he really was Mark Miller. Mark Miller wouldn't be scared, he thought. He'd probably have lost his say. Everyone would like him. Nobody would think Mark Miller was weird. Well, I guess we'd better find you a place to sit, said Mrs. Jewls. She put him at the empty desk between Todd and Bebe. Hi, Mark, said Todd. I'm Todd. You'll like Mrs. Jewls. She's the nicest teacher in the school. Todd, no talking, said Mrs. Jewls. Go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Hi, Mark, said Bebe. I'm Bebe Gunn. Hi, Benjamin said quietly. He decided he'd have to tell Mrs. Jewls his real name at recess. He cringed. He didn't know why, but for some reason he had trouble saying his own name. And what's your name, little boy? An adult would ask him. Benjamin Nushmutt, he'd answer. What? Benjamin Nushmutt. What? Benjamin Nushmutt. What? Benjamin Nushmutt. What? Benjamin Nushmutt. Oh, nice to meet you, Benjamin. He never knew what it was that made the person suddenly understand. When the bell rang for recess, everyone charged out of the room. Benjamin slowly walked to Mrs. Jewls' desk. Somehow, he had to tell her. Mrs. Jewls was sorting papers. Oh, hello, Mark, she said. How are you enjoying the class so far? Fine, said Benjamin. Good. I'm glad to hear that, said Mrs. Jewls. Benjamin shrugged, then walked out of the room. If I had told her my name, she would have thought I was weird for not telling her sooner, he realized. He stood at the top of the stairs and looked down. Recess was only 10 minutes long. It didn't seem worth it to go all the way down and then come all the way back up. He didn't have any friends down there anyway. He had never been more unhappy in his whole life. He sat on the top step. Mark Miller, he said out loud. It was an easy name to say. Mark Miller probably had to have lots of friends by now, he thought. Suddenly, he heard a low rumble. Then the stairs began to shake. It felt like an earthquake. This whole stupid school is going to fall over, he thought. He put his head between his knees. The rumbling got worse. I'm going to die, and nobody will even know who I am, he worried. The new kid, Mark Miller, the weirdo. But it wasn't an earthquake. It was just all the kids running back up the stairs. Hey, Mark, why are you sitting that way? Asked Dee Dee. You look funny, said Ron. Benjamin looked up. How come you weren't at recess? Asked Jason. We looked everywhere for you. Couldn't you find the playground? Asked Calvin. It's just straight down, said Bebe. You can't miss it. But don't go in the basement, warned Sherry. Whatever you do, don't go in the basement. We'll go down together at lunch, said Todd. That way you won't get lost. Benjamin smiled. He was glad everyone seemed to like him, or at least they liked Mark Miller. He wondered if they'd like Benjamin Nushmutt, too. The bell has rung, said Mrs. Jewls, standing in the doorway. Now, everyone get inside. She made Todd put a check next to his name on the board for being late. Mrs. Jewls handed a stack of worksheets to Damien and asked him to pass them out to the rest of the class. Benjamin looked at his worksheet. At the top right corner there was a place to put his name. He didn't know which name to put there, Mark Miller or Benjamin Nushmutt. He left it blank and started working on the first problem. Lewis, the yard teacher, entered the room carrying a white paper sack. Benjamin forgot his lunch, he said. His mother brought it. Who? Asked Mrs. Jewls. Benjamin? Said Lewis. There's no Benjamin in my class, said Mrs. Jewls. Are you sure? Asked Lewis. It looks like a good lunch." "I know the names of the children in my class," Mrs. Jewls said indignantly. "Well, I'll just leave it here until I figure this out," said Louis. He left the lunch on Mrs. Jewls' desk and walked out of the room. Benjamin frowned. He looked at the white paper sack on Mrs. Jewls' desk. He couldn't tell Mrs. Jewls' real name now. She'd think he was making it up just to get a free lunch. He wrote Mark Miller at the top of his worksheet. But one of these days, he knew he'd have to tell her his real name. Chapter 3. Bebe's Baby Brother. Mrs. Jewls asked Damien to pass back the homework. Bebe Gunn waited nervously. Except for art, her grades had not been very good lately. If she didn't start bringing home better grades, her parents said they wouldn't let her stay up past midnight. She did her best artwork after midnight. Damien handed Calvin his homework, then Todd, then Joy. "Where's yours?" asked Calvin. I don't know," said Bebe. "Did you do it?" asked Calvin. "Yes, I did it," said Bebe. "I worked extra hard on it. I hope Mrs. Jewls didn't lose it." Damien finished passing out the homework. Bebe never got hers. "Bebe, will you come here, please?" said Mrs. Jewls. She pushed out of her seat, stood up, and nervously walked to Mrs. Jewls' desk. "I did my homework, Mrs. Jewls," she said. "Really?" "Yes, I know," said Mrs. Jewls. She held Bebe's homework in her hand. "Phew," Bebe sighed with relief. "I was afraid you lost it." "No, I didn't lose it," Mrs. Jewls said sternly. She showed the back of the paper to Bebe. Someone had written, "Mrs. Jewls is fat as a hippopotamus, and she smells like one, too." "I didn't write that," exclaimed Bebe. "I love the way you smell." Mrs. Jewls smiled. "But if you didn't write it, who did?" "Ray," Bebe instantly replied. "Who's Ray?" "He's my little brother, Ray Gunn. He must have snuck into my room after I was asleep. He's always playing mean tricks on me. He knew how hard I worked on my homework." "Well, we'll show Ray," said Mrs. Jewls. She gave Bebe an A+. "There. I don't think he'll try that again." "Thanks," said Bebe. "You may have a Tootsie Roll Pop, too," said Mrs. Jewls. Bebe took a Tootsie Roll Pop out of the coffee can on Mrs. Jewls' desk, then returned to her seat. She proudly showed Calvin her A+. The next day, Mrs. Jewls asked Damien to hand back another batch of homework. "How come Damien always gets to do everything?" griped Kathy. "I'm sorry, Kathy," said Mrs. Jewls. "Would you like to pass back the homework?" "No," grumped Kathy. "I'm not your slave." Damien passed out the homework. Again, Bebe didn't get hers. Mrs. Jewls called her to her desk. On the back of her homework, someone had written, "Mrs. Jewls has a head full of oatmeal, and it leaks out of her ears." "I didn't write it," said Bebe. "Ray?" asked Mrs. Jewls. Bebe nodded. "Why don't you start checking the back of your homework?" suggested Mrs. Jewls. "I did when I woke up," said Bebe. "He must have done it after breakfast, while I was brushing my teeth. We had oatmeal for breakfast." She shook her head. "I won't brush my teeth any more." "You have to brush your teeth," said Mrs. Jewls. "My parents think he's such a little angel," Bebe complained. "He's always wrecking things, and then I'm always the one who gets in trouble. Why can't you be more like Ray, they say. Yesterday he threw all my underwear out the window. Then my mother yelled at me for it. She wouldn't believe that her little darling son would do something like that." Mrs. Jewls gave Bebe another A+ and another Tootsie Roll Pop. For Friday, everyone had to report and read it to the class. Bebe wrote her report about George Washington. She stood at the front of the room and read it out loud. George Washington never told a lie. Not like Mrs. Jewls. She lies all the time. That's why her nose is so big. And she snores when she sleeps. So Mr. Jewls has to wear earplugs. Everyone was laughing. Bebe stopped reading. What's so funny? She asked. Come here, said Mrs. Jewls. Bebe shrugged, then walked to Mrs. Jewls' desk. Mrs. Jewls showed her what she had just read. Did I just read that out loud? Bebe asked. Mrs. Jewls nodded. I was just reading it, Bebe explained. I wasn't listening. It was Ray again, wasn't it? Asked Mrs. Jewls. Had to be, said Bebe. Yesterday he put toothpaste in my socks. Then my mother got mad at me for making a mess and wasting toothpaste. Bebe got an A+ in her report and another Tootsie Roll Pop. After school, Mrs. Jewls called Bebe's mother on the phone. Hello, Mrs. Gunn. This is Mrs. Jewls from Wayside School. What's Bebe done now? Asked Mrs. Gunn. Bebe hasn't done anything wrong, said Mrs. Jewls. She's a wonderful girl. Well, that's a surprise, said Mrs. Gunn. She's always causing trouble at home. I wanted to talk to you about that, said Mrs. Jewls. I think you're being unfair to Bebe. I think she often gets into trouble when really Ray is to blame. Ray? Asked Mrs. Gunn. Yes, I think you know he's a perfect angel, said Mrs. Jewls. But some children can be angels on the outside and devils underneath. Yes, that sounds like Bebe, said Mrs. Gunn. I'm not talking about Bebe. I'm talking about Ray. Ray? Asked Bebe's mother. Who's Ray? Chapter 4. Homework. Mrs. Jewls was teaching the class about fractions and decimals. She explained that 0.5 was the same as 1/2. Mac raised his hand. Mrs. Jewls pretended not to see him. Ooh, ooh! Mac groaned as he stretched his hand so high that it hurt. Mrs. Jewls pretended not to hear him. Jenny raised her hand. Yes, Jenny, said Mrs. Jewls. Glad to call on anyone besides Mac. Mac had his hand raised, said Jenny. Thank you, Jenny, muttered Mrs. Jewls. Yes, Mac, what is it? I couldn't find one of my socks this morning, said Mac. Man, I looked everywhere. In my closet, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, but I just couldn't find it. I asked my mother, but she hadn't seen it either. That's very interesting, Mac, Mrs. Jewls said patiently. But what does that have to do with decimals? Because, said Mac, I could only find half of my socks. Oh, right, said Mrs. Jewls. Does anyone else have any questions about decimals? Yes, John. Did you look under the bed? Asked John. That was one of the first places I looked, said Mac, but it wasn't there. Did you check the dirty clothes? Asked Ron. Maybe it was never washed. I checked, said Mac. Do you have a dog? Asked Bebe. Maybe your dog took it. No, my dog doesn't wear socks, said Mac. Why didn't you just put on a different sock? Asked Allison. Even if it didn't match. I thought of that, said Mac. See, but then if I wore a sock that didn't match, I'd be left with only one sock of that color for tomorrow. And then if I wore that sock, I'd have to wear a sock that didn't match with it. And so for the rest of my life, I would never wear matching socks again. Well, be that as it may, said Mrs. Jewls, we really need to get back to decimals. Yes, Stefan. Once I had both my socks on, said Stefan, but I wasn't wearing any shoes. My mom had just whacked the floor too. I slid all around on it like I was skating. It was a lot of fun until I fell against the kitchen table and broke 2 dishes. Then I got in trouble. What's that got to do with my socks? Mac asked impatiently. Stefan shrugged. Did you ever find your other sock? Asked Leslie. Yep, said Mac, but you'll never guess where. In the refrigerator. He held out his arms in bewilderment. How did it get there? No one knew. See, here it is, said Mac. He climbed on top of his desk so everyone could see his feet. He pointed to his left foot and said, "This is the sock I had from the beginning." He pointed to his right foot and said, "And this is the sock I couldn't find." His socks were red with gold lightning bolts down the side. "Ooh, hot socks," said Mauricia. "No, it was cold after being in the refrigerator," said Mac, still standing on top of his desk. "I made it up a song, too, while I was looking for it. You want to hear it?" He sang, "I got one sock, looking for the other. One sock, looking for its brother. When I find that sock, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put it on my foot, and I'll stick it in with my shoe." The bell rang for recess. "Since we didn't finish the arithmetic lesson," said Mrs. Jewls, "you'll have to do the rest of it for homework." All the kids groaned as they headed outside. After recess was science. Mrs. Jewls was teaching the class about dinosaurs. She told the class that there were 2 types of dinosaurs, those that ate meat and those that ate only vegetables. "You mean like broccoli?" asked Rondi. "I don't think they had broccoli back then," said Mrs. Jewls. "Just as there were different kinds of animals back then, there were also different types of vegetables." Mac raised his hand. Mrs. Jewls pretended not to see him. "Ooh, ooh!" Mac groaned. He looked like he was going to explode. Mrs. Jewls pretended not to hear him. She called on Myron. "Mac has his hand raised," said Myron. Thank you, Myron," muttered Mrs. Jewls. "Yes, Mac. My uncle grew the biggest watermelon you ever saw in your whole life. Man, it was huge. It was so heavy I couldn't even lift it." "Mac, what does this have to do with dinosaurs?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "Because that must have been the kind of watermelon that dinosaurs ate," said Mac. "Did you eat it?" asked DJ. "Not all of it," said Mac, shaking his head. "Phew! It was too big for me, and I love watermelon." "What did it taste like?" asked Mauricia. "Delicious," said Mac, "but lots of seeds. You shouldn't eat the seeds. Otherwise a watermelon might grow inside your stomach. I once heard about a lady who was so fat that everyone thought she was going to have a baby, but she didn't have a baby, she had a watermelon." "Was it a boy or a girl?" asked Joy. Everyone laughed. Mrs. Jewls never finished her lesson about dinosaurs, so she had to assign it for homework. After school, Mac walked home with his girlfriend, Nancy. Nancy's class was on the 23rd floor of Wayside. Mac carried his arithmetic book, his science book, his reading book, his language book, and his spelling book. Nancy didn't have any books. "I'll carry your books for you, Mac," she offered. Mac gave Nancy his books. "Don't you have any homework?" he asked. She shook her head. "Man, it's unfair," said Mac. "Mrs. Jewls assigns more homework than any other teacher in Wayside School." And I'll stop the video there, ending chapter 4. But I hope you guys enjoyed the first part of this new read-along story with Wayside School is Falling Down. Again, very goofy, very silly, and kind of just has really random topics and twists and turns to each chapter. But thank you guys so much for watching today, and I look forward to seeing you in our continuation of Wayside School is Falling Down. As always, take good care and be safe. Bye.